Welcome everybody to our webinar today. The topic is the Lean Governance Manifesto Revisited. We've introduced this topic a few years ago, and based on the demand and the interest in what this whole Lean Governance Manifesto approach is, what we've done is we've updated and expanded the white paper into a full-blown ebook, and we've updated a lot of the models. So for people that have seen it in the past, you're going to see some enhancements to this that didn't exist before, and I think you'll get a lot out of it. First things first, from a housekeeping perspective, well, here's the agenda. Housekeeping we'll go into next. We'll talk about just what's enterprise governance, what's the definition, what is encompassed in the enterprise governance bundle. We'll talk about challenges and drivers with typical enterprise governance today. Then we'll introduce the concept of lean governance, or event-driven governance, is kind of one of the key principles of our Lean Governance Manifesto. We'll talk about the features and the overall approach to implementing event-driven governance. We'll give you a couple of use cases, an application to IT governance and an application to agile methodology, scaled agile governance. And then we'll suggest tomorrow, and then we'll conclude with questions and answers at the end. Housekeeping basis, we're in the welcome phase now. Again, the questions will be done at the end of the webinar. Please use the GoToMeeting panel to submit any questions that you might have. We do provide the link after the webinar, and I'll be distributing copies of the ebook along with that link in response for those that registered. And if you want copies of the slides, those will come along as well. So this should be very interesting and fun, and let's get into it. I like to start every governance conversation with a key guiding principle. And it's a quote that I adapted from Thomas Paine, and the quote is, as you see, that governance is best that governs best with least. The whole idea for governance, given its lack of popularity, I'll say, in the industry, that the key with all of this is to get enough governance coverage to minimize risk, exposure, and control key decision-making activities, and no more than that. So that's really the way to getting to a lightweight governance model. So our mantra is, don't fine-tune the governance model you're working with today. Tear it down and replace it with an event-driven governance framework. We'll tell you how in the webinar. First things first, what is enterprise governance? We've used this term for a few years, and we use enterprise governance because what we want to do is describe an overall approach to defining, implementing, managing, and evolving governance frameworks, policies, processes, and enforcement mechanisms, which of course you're doing to get some kind of competitive advantage. You're not doing it because it's joyfulness and fun. You're doing it for a specific reason, to ensure performance, to ensure compliance, to ensure alignment to business and IT strategy. So enterprise governance provides that strategic alignment, the policy and compliance framework, and the integration model for all of the enterprise governance domains, processes, and enforcement mechanisms if you choose to integrate all of the governance domains, processes, and enforcement mechanisms. Enterprise governance, in our view, is not an IT governance problem solely. Enterprise governance holds the business accountable for governing the business, holds IT accountable for governing IT, and assures that they're both governing what needs to be governed at the intersection of business and IT. So in our view, enterprise governance is both business and IT governance. Let's unpack this enterprise governance bundle and see what's inside. The list here includes things like corporate governance. Yes, corporate governance is included in the landscape of enterprise governance, even though it's, again, an activity that takes place at the board of directors level in publicly traded organizations. A lot of the activities happen in committees that are comprised of, board of directors members, but they do flow down from the corporate governance down into business and IT operational governance. So business and operational governance is next, and that's where we really talk about how does the business govern its activities and processes for good decision making. Compliance and risk is in this bundle. Things like PCI, HIPAA, security, privacy, other kinds of things from a compliance and risk perspective. And then there's our old friend, IT governance, and all of the domains within IT governance, PMO, portfolio management, enterprise architecture governance, security and privacy, and then specific domains within IT governance, like SOA governance, data governance, and even now, cloud governance, big data governance are areas that are challenging. It's important to, when we talk about this bundle of things in the enterprise governance landscape, that there's a compliance and risk perspective coming out of the business side of an enterprise, sometimes being driven out of the audit committee from the board of directors corporate governance perspective. But within IT governance, there's also an IT compliance and risk activity that may or may not be connected to corporate compliance and risk. So that's important to keep that in mind. The picture I'm showing you now just talks about visually these big corporate influences on enterprise governance, flowing down from the board of directors from a corporate governance perspective. I show an audit committee branching out of that. I have also coming out of that corporate governance box a chief risk officer, CRO is that acronym, driving compliance and risk from the enterprise business perspective. I show on the left the CIO accountable for IT governance driving down diagonally into this picture. In the middle, you'll see security and privacy either driven by the CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer, or the Chief Security Officer, whichever acronym you're using. What's interesting is security and privacy is a common thread that connects the normal view of IT governance with the compliance and risk oversight processes, both of which tend to be separate silos of governing activities in an enterprise, interestingly. Both of those arrows drive into the horizontal gold arrow going left to right, and that's where I talk about execution governance. So that's where you get into SDLC governance, project governance, the PMO activities, agile methodology governance, things that are involved in delivery of projects, flowing left to right. Now, the vertical bar in red, business governance question mark, is really important because while we hear about the business demanding better IT governance, what I don't hear and see very often are the mechanisms by which the business governs itself effectively while at the same time clamoring for better IT governance. So again, if you go back to how we describe enterprise governance, in our view, business governance is part of that equation as well, and that kind of is why I put it into this picture this way. Step back a moment. Why do we talk about governance? Why do we need governance? What's it for? At its basic level, enterprise governance challenges are often associated with a major reorganization of an enterprise, which either stresses or breaks the previous decision-making or enterprise alignment processes. So when you put in place a new organizational design, the governance model is typically implemented to overcome structural weaknesses that are part of any given organizational design approach. So if you go from functional to matrix or product to geographic, there's a governance structure that you would overlay and add to those to help ensure that the right stakeholders are involved in the appropriate decisions based on the way the org chart lines up. So that's a pretty important thing to keep in mind is governance at its pure functional level is a means to offset inherent flaws of an organizational structure. That said, other things drive the need for governance. Governance processes are changed or established to manage new requirements coming out of the business, new technologies being introduced, or adapt to changing management priorities. That's very important. The board of directors and business strategy changes, therefore certain policy requirements take on greater criticality. Those are really good reasons why you would adapt, change, or even implement a more formalized governance structure. Obviously, the next bullet there, the new sheriff in town kind of concept, is when there's a new leadership layer, leadership tier added in, they bring their governance reporting and other kinds of ideas into the organization. That can drive a change in the governance. And certainly the last one, new regulatory requirements, are often things that drive either enhancements, changes, or implementations of governance. But what are some more broad enterprise governance drivers to begin with? Why are we having this conversation? And this gets into some of the classic things that you've seen. This is where the business is demanding more oversight of IT spending. Again, in question mark there is, while it often is not governing itself very well. If an organization is riddled with late programs, project overruns, budget overruns, that's a good reason to start thinking about, do we have a governance problem of some kind? New compliance requirements, new risks, some kind of a competitive shift in the marketplace. You might bring in a more stringent oversight model for certain decisions. New technologies or shadow IT taking place without appropriate oversight. That's a driver for governance because you can think about this in the context of cloud computing. A lot of business organizations have been very aggressive adopters of public cloud services without IT being in the mix to vet and approve and review those things. So shadow IT can be a trigger for new or enhanced governance. Or the last one, and a very important one, governance can simply be required to ensure you're meeting a target level of business and IT and operational performance. That, by the way, is an excellent reason to revisit the way you govern. Governance is about decision-making, but you're doing governance, in my view, to drive target performance metrics and realization of the business and IT strategies. That's a good reason for governance. But governance has its challenges, as we know. There's governance silos all over the place. Again, silos within IT governance. Compliance and risk governance activities tend to live in their own silos. Security and privacy oftentimes is within its silo. And I'll show you some sub-silos beneath this. There are often ad hoc governance processes in place. And this is important to emphasize. Every organization is governing today. They might be governing formally, informally. They might be governing well or poorly, but there is a governance model in place. That may be poorly defined policies, that may be ad hoc processes, that may be done through heroic efforts of very smart people, but you're governing, and the question is that governance approach working for you or not? Another governance challenge is overboard governance via committee. So when I say overboard in quotes, that's a reference to the fact that a lot of governance models are implemented by creating governance boards, committees, creating layers of decision oversight. And those governance models almost always collapse under the sheer weight of the overhead and the amount of time it takes to force a decision through. We'll talk more about this in a few. Slow processes that always lead to no is a very common challenge of today's governance processes. So you go through the governance process, it takes a long time, and then you end up getting a no answer anyway. So it's like, hurry up and wait for that dreaded no that you were waiting for. So, you know, if they're going to tell you no, why can't they just get to it quicker, right? And then the last one, a very common response when we start talking about governance is that it's the police state. A lot of governance models are viewed with distrust and suspicion because it's like a policing function rather than a way to drive a desired level of performance. So there's ways to get around all of these common enterprise governance challenges. This picture here is just an illustration that shows silos of governance operating independently. This blue star is a governance framework that we use when we do analyses of enterprise governance. And as you can see, there's strategic planning and alignment at 12 o'clock, requirements and demand management over there at 1 o'clock, prioritization and focus over there at 3. Obviously, this isn't like a clock because I don't have a slice for every number. But you can work your way around this wheel: business and enterprise architecture, funding and budgeting, portfolio management, acquisition, program management and execution, compliance and risk, etc. Well, many times, if there's a governance activity for some of these subdomains of governance, there'll be a separate governance team a separate set of policies, a separate enforcement set of mechanisms for each of those governance areas. And so when a project goes through the act of being governed, it's not done through a single point of contact where they can get all of this stuff done at once. It's often done through many meetings and many oversight processes, and that's a continued source of frustration for people that are in the trenches at the project level doing work. So the silos, bad thing. Here's another illustration of a anti-pattern of governance where it's overboard. If your governance model begins with and looks like an org chart, it's probably a poorly designed governance model. If it looks like a process flow diagram or swim lanes, that's better. But committee-driven governance models are almost always manually executed, cumbersome, time-consuming, and ineffective. And it's usually a symptom, again, of this PPOT anti-pattern. And the anti-pattern is simply this. If you've got a governance requirement, and the first thing you do is create an org chart or a set of governance committees, that's a bad thing. Excuse me. Anytime you attack a governance requirement with an organizational design, you're setting yourself up to have a slow, cumbersome, org chart-driven approach based on committees and based on manual oversight, and they almost always outlast their effectiveness. So never start a governance requirement by creating a governance organizational model. Now, traditional governance characteristics, and then we'll shift into the kind of the 2B view in a moment. Traditional governance models are heavy on organizations and boards, typically meeting intensive. In fact, you can't do governance today without Outlook Scheduler, right? I mean, that's if you don't have Exchange to get visibility to everyone's calendars, you can't do governance today. These kinds of governance models add layers of friction and overhead to existing processes. They delay decision-making because it's built on a meeting-based foundation. And most critically of all, these committee-driven governance models do not empower the workforce to make decisions on their own with respect to some governance requirements. So that's where it starts to feel like a police state. So this brings us back to the lean governance best practice. The PPOT mnemonic simply means when you're thinking about a governance requirement, think about the policies and then the enforcement processes first. Once you've got the policy model and the enforcement processes as lean and streamlined as possible, then think about the organizational model, and then think about any augmentation via tools and technology. Too many organizations, again, either build an org chart of governance with lots of committees, or the other side of the anti-patterns of governance is to put in a tool on the assumption that that tool is going to solve your governance requirements, if only, right? But we all know that that is not a recipe for success. So policies and processes first, then you're going to and any tools that might be appropriate. So why consider lean and event-driven governance? When I use lean governance and event-driven governance, I use those interchangeably. The Lean Governance Manifesto is an overall approach where we use event-driven governance concepts to drive a lean governance implementation. So when I say lean and event-driven or event-driven, I'm talking about the same thing. A lean governance model absolutely helps avoid policy bloat. One of the biggest problems in governance today is a set of a body of policies that is outdated, that is too complex, that is too voluminous. Those are very common challenges. So one of the first things with lean governance and event-driven governance is to cut back on the number of policies. That'll help you enforce them better, believe it or not. Lean governance model will minimize governance organizations and committees and boards. A lean governance, event-driven governance model will focus on critical processes and gaps because, while there's many things that could be governed, not all of the governance activities have the same impact on business performance and IT performance. So you've got to pick which requirements are critical to executing the business and IT strategies. And lean and event-driven governance model, lastly, emphasizes rules before tools. Get the processes and policies first. Think about the tools later. The bumper sticker at the bottom of this slide is very important. A lean governance model will be just in time, it'll be just enough, and no more than that. Let's not put any friction into your governance model. Now, let's define what we mean by event-driven governance. Event-driven governance is an enterprise governance design philosophy that ensures an effective governance model that drives performance and execution while it avoids the layers of overhead and organizational complexity that are typical of the traditional governance view. Our premise is that a governance model should be a virtual framework triggered by governance events associated with identified business or IT processes. Once these predefined governance triggers or events occur, the governance model comes to life, it performs its duties, and then it goes away. We don't want to create a standing permanent structure that's an overlay on top of the functional org chart for the enterprise. Event-driven governance is explicitly intended to be lightweight, lean, and virtual. It's intended to be bolstered by very clearly defined policies and processes, and then implemented using trust-based designs. Trust-based governance we'll talk about in a little bit. You can do this in your organization by empowering your workforce and pushing decision autonomy deeper in the organization. Here's an illustration of event-driven governance in action. So notionally, you've got a set of business processes taking place, represented by the tan chevrons. And in those activities, there's an event trigger that takes place, again, a predefined event from which you'll launch your governance and oversight activities. So the governance model gets invoked. You begin to do policy enforcement, either through oversight or self-governance or other means. The governance process activities take place. You trigger and deal with any exceptions or escalations that are part of the governance model. The trigger might even cause you to do an update to the governance model, either updating the policies, updating principles, updating a specific domain of governance. But once that activity has triggered the governance model and it's done its work, it goes away again. So that leads us to 8 event-driven governance principles to take heart of. First, avoid permanent governance boards or committees. Don't do it. You may not be able to go entirely without, but we can show you some of the designs on how to minimize that if you have to have a standing model. But our first approach is don't put in permanent boards. Second, enforce only the critical enterprise policies when they're triggered by the governance event model. You can't govern effectively with 10,000 policies. You can't govern with 500 policies. So you've got to think about what are the policy areas that are critical to your governance performance now and enforce fewer policies better. 3, focus on the vital few principles and policies that drive the desired business and IT performance. That's getting a related one to number 2. Number 4, use policy enforcement event models that define where, when, and how policies will be enforced. So again, it's all about defining which events are going to trigger governance and which things will not. And this is what allows you to put in this event-driven governance kind of concept. Continuing on, number 5, define policy threads. Define core policy threads that connect oversight processes and governance events into an integrated overarching policy enforcement model. So what an example of this is quite simple. Using IT governance as a use case, and we'll do this visually in a few, when you've got a phase gate exit out of concept or out of design, or pick any of your normal SPLC phase gates, you trigger a governance activity, and that governance activity should be used to perform all of the governance activities relevant at that point in time. So if IT governance processes can be governed there, and if the compliance and risk people can latch onto that event and do their oversight, wouldn't that be great? The idea is to collapse and integrate governance processes around the fewest number of governance events possible. That's how you streamline and lean out your governance model. But the other way to lean out and streamline a governance model is number 6, implement trust-based governance. We are a firm believer that you can implement self-governing teams and community governance concepts borrowed from the open source community. And you can make these 2 tiers of your governance model and have a very effective governing concept and a scalable governing concept that will very much lead you to the results you're looking for, but in a way that doesn't impose a top-down police state on your delivery teams. So number 6 becomes a very important part of a lean governance approach. 7, collapse key governance domains, processes, and mechanisms into the fewest number of events that meet the requirements. And then number 8, design the governance model to be just enough, just in time, no more than that.